Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ryan, and it's my pleasure to be presenting for you today. Something about me. So I've been in the industry for around 17 years as a teacher trainer, manager, and we're going to be talking about teaching reading today. Now, this is a huge subject. We're probably only going to scratch the surface, but hopefully we'll hit a few important points. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions at the end of the session today. I'm actually near London at the moment. I taught in mostly Poland, some other countries as well. I've taught people from all over the world, from Saudi Arabia, from Europe, from South America, just about all corners of the globe. So I'd really like to know where you're watching from today. Drop me a comment. Let me know where you are in the world. So while I'm waiting to find out where you guys are, a little bit about reading. So reading is a vitally important skill to teach. It kind of raises all of the other skills as well. It's an important life skill. Apart from it learning English, it's good to read a variety of different texts. So it's really important that we get this right in the classroom and teach our students the important skills for reading. Okay, let's see. Pierre is from Galway in Ireland, beautiful part of the world. Hello. Cass is from South America. That's great. We've got Kate from New York. Hi, Kate. Anthony is also South Africa. We've got a user from the Czech Republic. Tiasha is from India. Hello. Teresa from the Philippines. This is fantastic. Arash, hello Arash, you're from Iran. And Anthony says there's a bit of an echo. How's my audio? Give me a thumbs up if the audio is okay. Megan's from South Africa. And Renuka, hope I've got that right, is from the USA. Mary's from sunny South Africa. Well, it's sunny here today as well. And we can look forward to some sunny weather, hopefully. Okay, hopefully you can all hear me all right. Let's get into today's presentation. Okay, so teaching reading. So it's a quick overview of what I'd like to talk about today. We've got a lot to get through, so hopefully we can hit the important topic points. First of all, we're going to talk about approaches to reading, about all of the different ways that we can go about teaching reading in the classroom. We're going to be discussing something called the task feedback cycle, or the circle, or the productive skills process for your lessons. We'll go on to talk about how to choose the most appropriate tasks in your reading lessons. We'll talk about skimming and scanning. We'll also discuss top-down and bottom-up processing, two different kind of schools of thought, if you were, when we're discussing teaching receptive skills. We'll talk about also extensive reading and good practice for your students, how to encourage them to read more. And then later we'll get on to a Q&A session. So start being aware, if you've got any questions, you can put them near the end, please, so I can pick those up, and we'll try to address any questions you've got about teaching reading. Okay, let's get straight into it. So, approaches to reading. Why should we teach reading? Well, as I mentioned before, it's an important life skill. Everyone needs to be able to read well in any language for their work, for their study, in their everyday lives, whether it's for reading for pleasure or for reading for passing an exam, reading as part of your job. So we need to instill these skills in our students. Reading is also very good, as I mentioned, for raising the bar in most of the other skills and abilities, competencies in learning English. For vocabulary, for sure, this is a great way to increase your student vocabulary. Um, Reading increases awareness of grammar and language points, punctuation, as we talked about last time. Um, just about every aspect of English we can improve, or it helps to reinforce that by reading well. Um, Reading is also very good for writing. If you want to be a good writer, if your students want to write well for exams, for IELTS, for example, or for the Cambridge set of exams, lots of reading, lots of diverse and varied reading will help with understanding how to write better as well. You can see the structures there. Um, Providing good reading models and genres, for example, is it an email structure? Is it an essay structure? Something else? And essays and so on. Lots of different kinds of formats for text or genres provide a good model for your students. Also, it's a good way to instigate to start discussion in your classes. If you want to introduce a new topic, uh, providing a reading text is a good springboard to do that. It can engage your students from the beginning. It can kind of get their imaginations going, kind of activate their mental schema for those that are studying a little bit deeper into the psychology and the actual methodology of teaching. So this is why we teach reading, and it's fun to teach reading. It's fun to read, and it's fun for you to kind of instill that enjoyment in reading in your students. So a couple more about the approaches to reading. It's a receptive skill. So a receptive skill, it's coming towards us. Reading and listening is a receptive skill. It's coming towards us. So these are just some of the approaches to reading that I'm discussing here. So reading is like listening. It's a receptive skill. It's a little bit different from reading, getting your students to read to themselves or reading out loud. Reading out loud is not really receptive. It's something a bit different. Um, Reading to understand the text, you wouldn't read that necessarily out loud for other people to hear. That's a kind of different skill. It's very useful in its own right if you've got clear aims for that in your lessons. But reading for information is a receptive skill like listening. The only difference between reading and listening is that, as we'll see, people read at different speeds. If you've got a listening text in your class, it has a set time, doesn't it? It's a 5-minute clip or a 3-minute audio clip, and then it's finished when it's finished. The difference is if you've got a text, a reading text, people will read that more quickly or more slowly than other students. So bear that in mind. We'll talk a bit more about that later. We'll talk about some different kind of processes of reading as well. People read in different ways. Some people like to take their time and carefully look at each sentence. Some people like to read more quickly to get a general overview about that. And we'll go a little bit deeper into those questions a bit later. Actually, what I want to ask you now, and if you could put your answers in the comments, what kind of problems students might have when reading in English? What kind of problems might students have when reading in English? I'll give you a clue. One of the problems will be related to understanding vocabulary. Put some of your thoughts into the comments, please. What problems have your students had when reading? So while you're thinking about that, a bit more about the different approaches to reading. So, as I mentioned, some people like to read quite quickly to get the general understanding, the general gist of a text, what it's all about. Then they might come back later to try to pick out some vocabulary, for example, or to kind of read between the lines, get a deeper understanding of the text, maybe to look at certain grammar points that they've identified. Some people like to be very analytical when they're reading. Um, and some people like to kind of take lots of notes when they're reading, or stop, pause, look up a word, and come back to the text later. All right, so thank you for your answers. So we've got some ideas about problems with reading. So comprehension. Thank you, Renika. Yes, it can be difficult to understand a text sometimes and get that deep comprehension of the text. Arash says lack of knowledge in vocabulary. Yes, exactly. So reading, vocabulary, they're strong partners, aren't they? We need to have an understanding and a good command of vocabulary in order to unpack the text and to get that across to our students. Eleanor, discouraged by not having enough vocab to understand specific information. Yes, exactly. So discouragement, um, which can affect motivation or investment in your students when reading a text. Very good point. Tiyasha, comprehension due to lack of vocabulary knowledge. Yes. MFP. Yes. Arash. Of course, this is the mantra, isn't it? Meaning, form, pronunciation. I'm sure you're all aware of that on your courses. MFP, MFP. Go to bed reciting it to yourself every night. I'm sure that you do that. Not coming from Roman alphabet. Oh, yes. Great, fantastic point, Pierre. Pierre. Yes, so the English alphabet is kind of sometimes can be taken for granted, but from people where this is not the case, the alphabet is completely different. It can be absolutely unbelievable and difficult to look at. And Cass says some words and phrases in the text might be a bit advanced for them, causing them to struggle. So so lots of comments about vocabulary here. Thank you very much. So here's a couple of other examples there. Of course, there are lots of issues and challenges for your students, but here are some more. What kind of problems might students have when reading English? So, don't know vocabulary. They need to look up words in a dictionary, for example. Yes, so this is kind of a common thing where you present a text to your students, but they're always having to stop, look up words, or ask a question to clarify a meaning of some vocabulary. So, what would be a good approach to that? Maybe we should kind of encourage kind of reading fluency for our students. So, maybe point out that it's not necessary to read every single thing and understand everything in the first reading. You can always circle back. You can identify vocabulary. But if the meaning is not hindered by understanding every single point of vocabulary, your students can make progress with a text. Slow progress in understanding a text, yeah. So again, this goes back to motivation. If if your readers are not kind of really engaged or find it difficult to understand the text, they can lose interest. They'll put the book down or put the text to one side. It can really get in the way of this kind of fluent reading that I mentioned. I think it's the same for everybody, though, isn't it? Have you ever read a text, a paragraph, and you think, hold on, what's going on here? And even as a native reader or a native speaker, you've read the text and you think, hold on, I need to rewind that and read that again just to make sure I understand that. This is a different, process of reading as well. Sometimes we need to come back to it much later. We can understand words in the text. We understand the individual kind of components and vocabulary items in a text, but not the overall meaning. This can be very frustrating. So students might be able to unpick the vocabulary, but not the whole story of that part of the text, that vocabulary, or even in the sentence level. And we've mentioned motivation as well. This might be connected to the type of text that your student is looking at. More about that later. Okay, so let's go on to talk about the task feedback circle or cycle, or the receptive skills process, procedure, sometimes it's called. There are many different versions here. But before we look at that, just a general overview. It's a roadmap, it's a guide. It's not set in stone. You can see what works, you can alter it. It's a very good blueprint for your lessons. Give it some time to gestate, see if it works, see if you like it. Can you add to it? Is there something you want to change about it? It's really there to help you and your students, of course. Okay. The important thing about any text, whether it's a listening text or reading text, is to grade the task and not the text. This is a kind of general view, a general kind of guide. So in that way, you can use this, for example, the same text with different levels. You wouldn't change the text necessarily, but you would change the task. You would grade the task appropriate to the level that you're teaching. Maybe some more about that later. We should also think about the task first and then the text. So when we're in the lesson, in the stage of our lesson, present the task before presenting the text. Well, number one, because it's just easier to manage it that way. We can decide when we want to unleash our text to our students. But we want to focus on the task first before distracting them with a text. That's the general idea here. And I would say it's about the process of learning to read better, rather than the product of reading and understanding a text. Less about the final outcome. Yes, I understand that text perfectly. Rather about the process and giving your students confidence in order to tackle more complex texts as they make progress in their learning. Okay, we'll come back to this in a moment. I'd like to just show you the basic model of the task feedback circle or cycle. Okay, well, let's start at the lead-in part. The lead-in is how you kind of give a good introduction to the text that you want to use with your students. Introduce the topic. It could be a discussion, for example. You might want to show a picture or a sample of the text. Open up a discussion, some questions. Very importantly, you might want your students to predict what happens in the text. Prediction is such a powerful tool when we're talking about receptive skills. So you could show a picture, part of the text, ask your students to predict what comes next. So the pre-task is about when you're setting that first you're setting that first task. So we want to be setting a clear task with clear instructions. Check your instructions. The first task should be something less challenging, a gist task. Gist is to understand the basic um, meaning of a text, the basic idea of a text. So you might say, what's the topic of this text about? Or you might ask a very simple question about the writing of this text, what the attitude of the writer is, for example. You don't want to set a complicated task in the beginning. You might want to pre-teach some vocabulary at this point. Um, we'll talk about pre-teaching vocabulary in a moment, but that might be something that you want to do if it's a brand new text with new vocabulary for your students. So the next stage is that we get our students to read the text. And remember, because students read at different speeds, we need to set a time limit. This is the difference between a reading and a listening text. So students read the text. They don't have to understand everything all at once. We're just focusing on the task here. And in the beginning, it's a simple task. And once they've completed that task, well, you could circle back if you wanted to. If you feel that that task was too challenging, give your students another run at the same task to make sure that they fully understood that before moving on to something a bit more complicated. You might, after setting just a simple task, you might set a task with looking for more details or more specific information inside the text. So you're coming around again to the same text. And then the last part of the cycle is to follow up with an activity that complements the receptive skill. So in other words, if you're teaching a reading, if you're looking at a text, you've done some work on that text, maybe some specific information or language, then you'd like to follow that up with a productive skills session or productive practice. So productive, we're talking about speaking or or writing something in response to that text. It could be a writing homework text that you set, for example. It could be the in-class discussion. It could be a role play. It could be something creative involved in speaking. It could be just giving opinions about the text. It could be a quiz. I'm sure you've got some great ideas there. So a little bit more about the cycle, the task feedback circle. So the idea is to go from the big picture, the the general idea about the text, and then go to a more detailed question and task. And then we want to maybe focus on some specific language, some topic vocabulary, or grammar points, or phrasal verb points, or punctuation, whatever it might be. It could be comprehension, it could be sentence structure. Anything that you identify will be useful in that text. So we're kind of starting at the top and we're kind of drilling down. We're drilling down, going from the big picture to the more detailed information. Another way to think about that is the kind of pre-text, text, post-text model. So pre-text, we're getting our students interested in that text. We're making predictions. We're getting let's say the interest risen in that particular text, discussion beforehand, prediction. And then we get to the text, we set our task, easy task, and then more complicated, more challenging task. And then we go to the post-text stage where we're discussing that more. We're providing a follow-up task or activity that reflects. So we're going from receptive to productive skills practice. Okay, so let's just maybe just double back just to remind ourselves about some of the highlights here of the task feedback circle. So it's a roadmap. It's not exactly set, but it's a very good guide. We need to grade the task, not the text. We need to provide the task first and then the text. We need to give a time limit because reading occurs at different speeds for different students. And I believe it's more about the process than the actual product. Here's a text. Tell me what you think. It's about the process of understanding that text. Okay. All right. Let's talk now about understanding how to choose appropriate tasks. Okay. So what we need to do is, I think, is to choose the tasks that mirror what we need to do in real life. We need to match the task to the topic and the text. And I think we need to reflect what happens in the real world. So this could be, for example, finding a piece of information. Why do we read? Why do we read as workers, as students, as people that want to read for pleasure? Why do we read? What is the real life function of reading that we can put into the classroom to make it useful for our students? Well, for example, we go on holiday. We need to find the appropriate bus timetable or specific information on a menu, for example. We need to know when our train is leaving if we go abroad. And it's the same for English learners as well. If we want to help them when they come here to study or to work, they need to pick out specific information, don't they? We need to look at prices of things. We need to look at rules and regulations for different contexts, for at work or in university, for example. These are the kind of real life things that we need to put into our tasks in the classroom. If something like IELTS is quite, or other exams are kind of orientated towards that, it's kind of practical skills. So this is one way for you to look at what type of tasks you need to set. And we'll talk about what kind of texts as well a little bit further on today. We should also discuss the difference between skimming and scanning if we're talking about setting tasks. So as you may have seen in your courses so far, the difference between skimming and scanning. Okay, so skimming is, imagine the stone skimming across the surface of a pond. It's reading for gist, the quick reading to understand the key topics, the main ideas, and the overall theme. So we're getting the basic idea of the structure of the text or the genre. When I talk about genre, it could be an essay, it could be a novel, it could be a text instruction manual, and so on. So this is just an overall view. When it comes to scanning, think about when you're buying your shopping in the supermarket. The cashier is scanning your items. So they're looking for the barcode. They're looking for specific information. We're looking in the text for names, numbers, addresses, dates and times, and so on. So this goes back to our practical task setting. We're looking for times of trains and planes. we're looking for dates, and we're looking for specific information. So skimming on the surface, general understanding, scanning with zero, we're lasering in on a part of the text to understand some specific information. So when you set your tasks, think about the cycle that we talked about. So the first task should be, what kind of task should it be? It should be for general understanding, perhaps a gist task. And then we can widen that out to look for more specific information. So again, I'm going to put out the question, what kind of tasks would you think are appropriate for your students? What kind of reading activities or tasks can you think of that will benefit students? What have you done previously with your students? I'll go back to some examples here, and I'll just leave that up for you to have a look at. So if you can let me know in the comments, what kind of tasks do you think are appropriate for reading lessons? Okay, while you're thinking about that, let's go on to just a summary of about choosing appropriate tasks. So here are some examples for you. Uh, for example, reading and reordering paragraphs. So what we've got is a complete text. We can cut up the paragraphs, and our students can reorder those paragraphs. This is a great kind of a task to set individually, then into pairs or groups, so the students can compare their ideas, and then you can come back and get some feedback on that. It's a really good way of looking at essay structure, for example. Also, we can find words in the text and match them to definitions. So this is a great way to build vocabulary. We can give students part of a text and think about a title to go along with that text. We can take specific words out of a text and get our students to put them back into the text. Right? You can give them a list of vocabulary if you wanted to, or you can actually let them come up with their own ideas. You can elicit some vocabulary to go back into the text. And as I mentioned, you can discuss the implications of the text, interpretations, the meanings and feelings associated with the text. This might be good for a follow-up at the end of looking at a text. So you've got some great ideas here. So Renuka says, ask questions based on the text. Very good. Yes, these could be comprehension questions. Looking for a specific date or name. Absolutely. Yes. And scanning task. Yes. So this is looking for the specific information that we mentioned. Mero says they could pretend they have to do a newspaper article or report on the content and come up with a good heading or title. Yes, I like that. Check that they understand the overall meaning. Yes, that you could say, okay, you're an editor of a newspaper or magazine. What's the headline? What's the tomorrow's headline that's going live online for this big news story? I really like that idea. And Renuka says we can ask students to write sentences using words from the text. Yes, great. So we're kind of recasting, reformulating vocabulary from the text. Wonderful. Okay, let's crack on. So let's briefly look at top-down, bottom-up processing, and then I'll leave some time for your questions and answers. Anthony also says, write a summary. Yeah, very good, Anthony. Good follow-up. So bottom-up processing and top-down processing, two kind of schools of thought about how we should approach a text. Bottom up is how you might imagine it sounds. So we're looking at the kind of building blocks, the small pieces of a text. So we're looking at individual sentences, vocabulary, items, um, using the constituent parts of text to build up an image. So we're going from the bottom to the top of the understanding of the text. Top down is the opposite, isn't it? So we're using our information about how we already understand some aspects of that text. We're using what we already know. We can predict a certain amount of that from our previous experience. We can look at the overall structure of a text, and then we can drill down to the smaller parts of the text. So we can look at vocabulary, we can look at grammar points, we can look at attitudes of the writer, or um, the comprehension of the text, the underall meaning of that, or look at specific information. So depending on how you want to set your task, think about how you want to approach that. Is it top down or bottom up? So we should also talk about extensive reading. Okay, so extensive reading is the opposite of intensive reading. Intensive reading is kind of like looking at the detail, the kind of drilling down into the parts of the text. Intensive, this is for study, for example, or look for specific information. We're looking at the text closely for understanding and in lots of detail. Extensive reading is kind of more fluid, if you like to think about it in terms of speaking. We talk about fluently speaking, but we can also read in a more kind of fluent way as well. Our reading can flow. So this is more for enjoyment, maybe for pleasure. It's less stop-start reading. As I mentioned, sometimes we read a text, we have to stop, look at vocabulary, we need to go back and read something again. This is kind of a bit more intensive reading, but extensive reading, I think, is what we need to encourage more our students to do. And read for pleasure, read outside the classroom as well, not only in the classroom. Read a variety of texts. So why should we think about extensive reading? Well, there are lots of reasons. Number one being that it impacts strongly on the other skills that we need to teach and reinforces other aspects of language learning, vocabulary, grammar, comprehension, structure, punctuation, a whole range of different things here. Extensive reading, we can go back after we've kind of read something extensively. We might take a note, we might underline or ask our students to underline vocabulary to then later come back and look at intently or look at for more detail. This way, it impacts less on the flow of reading and the enjoyment of reading, the motivation and frustration sometimes. We don't have to understand everything in the first reading. We can come back. I think more reading, it means more understanding and general linguistic confidence. We want our students to be confident in learning English. Reading can definitely improve that confidence. So I would definitely encourage your students to read a lot inside and outside of the classroom. What should your students read? Well, there's so much. There are things that are designed especially for the classroom, things that we might use in our textbooks and materials books, course books. And there are authentic texts that are not written specifically for language learning. So internet, blogs, newspapers, magazines, YouTube comments, social media. English is everywhere. The great thing about learning English is that it's really accessible for our students. It's everywhere. Encourage your students to read, and read some more outside the classroom. It could be graded readers, for example, graded readers. These are specifically um, intended for language learners, so they are graded for a level, pre-intermediate, intermediate, advanced, and so on. Sometimes they come with a vocabulary section, a glossary, um, and this would be a good kind of entree, a good introduction to reading more extensively. Readers can be used individually with your students, or you can do it as a whole class reading. Why not? Set a chapter to read for homework, and then you can come back later in a later lesson and talk about what you've just read. Talk about the ideas, the language, the vocabulary. The thing about reading a book is we don't have to start at the beginning. Uh, have you ever picked up a book and gone straight to the end to find out who did it in a murder mystery? That's cheating. But we don't have to start at the beginning of a book. We can jump in to interesting parts of the story. Um, we can jump in at interesting points of the novel, for example, where there's interesting language there, something exciting happens. And then this might encourage your students to come back and read what happens before and after. So that might be a good way to think about it. I didn't mention graphic novels as well. So there are lots of graphic novels out there that are a really great accessible way to access sometimes quite dense ideas and dense stories. Perhaps your students are into science fiction or Lord of the Rings or historical dramas or something along those lines, and they'd like to read in English, but it's a bit too a bit daunting for them, a bit scary for them to jump into a big thick book. So the answer would be a reader, or even jump to a graphic novel to get to the really interesting parts of the story. I would really encourage your students to enjoy their reading as much as possible. Reading is an integral part of our teaching experience. So here's a quick summary of what we talked about today. So we talked briefly about why we should teach reading, because it's very important for our students. It's a life skill. It's a life learning skill. We talked about the task feedback cycle. So about the way that we introduce a text, we set a task, and then we perhaps pre-teach vocabulary. Pre-teaching vocabulary, is it true to real life? Do we get our vocabulary pre-taught to us in real life? But it could be very useful for our students to do that if it's a new text. We talked about how to set appropriate tasks for our students, like setting something simple and then going to the more challenging as we drill down into a text. We talked about top down and bottom up processing. So do we start at the building blocks of a text and work our way up, or do we kind of approach that from the top, the general understanding of a text, and then drill down? We also talked about extensive reading as well, to encourage our students to read more, read, and read again. Especially good for building vocabulary, grammar understanding, structure, and all kinds of important things for our students to learn. Okay, all right. So I think I'm going to hand over to you in the last section today. We're going to have a Q&A section. So if you've got any questions about what we've talked about today, now is the time to ask questions in the comments. Let me just have a look at some more of your suggestions while you're thinking about your questions. Arash talks about warmers and pre-teaching words that are higher than their English level. Yes, this is the +1 concept, the leveling up of your students' capabilities in English. Make it a challenge for them. Set the challenge appropriately. And also the CEFR framework as well. Yes, we can go up the levels. Comics, yes, exactly. When I was learning Polish and other languages, I I looked at comics because I could use the images to help me understand the context of what was going on in the text. Should the extensive reading assigned? I'm not quite sure what you're asking there, Manuka. Could you ask that question again, please? Arash says, how should we grade the language, both in finding an authentic text and in teacher presentation in terms of tenses from the perspective of CEFR? Great question. Well, when we talk about grading language in any context, if it's what we say during the lesson or when we're setting a task, we should take out all unnecessary, complicated language. So, any idiomatic language, phrasal verbs, colloquial language, to make it our instructions and our task appropriate for the level that we're teaching. We don't want the task to be challenging for our students. We want them to understand the task appropriate to their level. So think about a simplification of the task for that level. I hope that helps. Specifically, how can we divide 12 tenses between 6 grades? Okay, well, yeah, I think that's overcomplicating the issue there. I think we need to take an approach to grading that is into kind of maybe elementary, pre-intermediate, intermediate. We don't need to slice up the CEFR into all of the constituent levels here. We need to kind of have a think about our own students' capabilities as well, because it's not a biscuit cut, it's not a cookie cutter solution here. We need to actually understand our students as well in order to set appropriate tasks and to grade our language. Should we tell the students what to read? Oh, I don't think we should tell students. We should present options to our students. We should ask them what they want to read. In my opinion, what are they interested in? If it's something specific for a specific exam, for example, we can highlight certain text for them to read, and we can give them a range of appropriate text for them to read. I would never tell anyone what to read for their own enjoyment outside the class. Inside the class, it might be not a question of telling them, but providing appropriate text for your students. I hope that helps. If you're teaching a student, Kaz says, that has a good grasp on English but are showing signs of dyslexia, how would you go about helping them to make reading easier and more enjoyable? That's a fantastic point, Kaz. I'm so glad that you raised that. For example, I often suffer with dyslexia. I often struggle to read some types of texts, and I think I display some dyslexic tendencies, let's say. And I understand that how difficult it could be for students, and this is can be a real problem. I hope that the situation is getting better. I hope dyslexia is identified better now than it used to be in the past, let's say. We can talk about special educational needs. If you're lucky to work in an organization where there is someone dedicated to helping students with special educational needs or specific needs, like dyslexia, then you can refer to their help. They can help you identify and help support students with this. I don't have some of the techniques at hand, Cass, unfortunately, but it's all about making it as aiding and helping students with dyslexia as possible. Could be about the color of the paper. It could be about the text or the font that is used, and giving extra support to the student. It's a really good question. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to tell you exactly what you should do for dyslexia because it's not my specific area of expertise. Hopefully, you can find that in one of the forums. I'm sure that there are many people that know more about that than I do, and they can help you with that, Cass. Renuka says, would you give any classroom task for extensive reading? Yeah, sure. Why not? But I think extensive reading takes time, doesn't it? If you think about that, to read something extensively, it's not a short task that you might fit into the arc of a lesson in your classroom. You might set a homework task, for example. You might say, go read that chapter. When you've read the chapter, let's come back and we'll talk about the themes that are in that chapter. We can talk about the characters. We can talk about some of the language, or you can identify some language and vocabulary items, for example, from that extensive reading. You could set comprehension questions, for example, for extensive reading. You could set a writing mini essay, for example, to talk about the themes or the motifs expressed in that text, in that extensive text. It's a good question. Yeah, very good, everybody. Okay, are there any more questions? Are there any questions about the cycle, the task, setting a task for the students? Riona says, could you give an example of how bottom-up processing would work in the classroom? That's a great question. Okay, so when we're talking about bottom-up, okay, so bottom-up, we're starting with the foundations, the building blocks of a text, the individual parts of a text. So what we might do is look at vocabulary items from a text. Before we look at the actual text itself, we might look at sentence structure. We might look at particular grammar, a particular tense, for example, or a little bit more of the general, it's not the general idea about the text, but the general structure. If it's an essay, the paragraph structure, for example, the sequence. We might talk about topic sentences, for example. So when we're talking about bottom up, we're looking at the details, the more kind of specific details of the text, and then we're working up to a deeper understanding of the text. We're starting from the bottom, going up. Anthony said, how do you motivate a learner if they struggle to read further? Yes, okay. Yeah. So in motivation, I think, has to come from inside. It has to be intrinsic rather than extrinsic. If someone says you must read that text, how do you think your students might react to that? How would you react to that? How many times can you think about when you were in school and you had to read something that you were not interested in at all, just because someone told you you had to read it? This is extrinsic, kind of pushing you to read it. We need to get our students, we need to pull them towards a text themselves. So we need to understand, I think, what our students are interested in. What are their interests? What is their motivation? What would invest them into a text? What do they like? What are they into? Would they like to read about someone hundreds of years ago that invented something. Maybe they're really into their history. Maybe they're more into learning about culture, about travel, for example, or about comics or graphic novels, or whatever your students are into. Get them into it. Get them to read about that. I'm sure they read away from the class anyway. What do they read? What do they read in their native language? Get them to read about that in English too. Why not? There's so many things out there. Renuka says, give them incentive. Yes, incentive. Give them, try to kind of kindle there. There's not free advertising, but we need to kindle, we need to ignite their interest in reading in English. Once maybe you can identify what they like to read outside the classroom, what they read for fun, what they read for enjoyment, and get them to maybe read that in English as well. Is there a specific model for designing concept checking questions, avoiding just yes or no questions? Yeah. So you want to be getting to the root in your this is a bit away from the topic of reading or teaching reading, but I get where you're coming from, Arash. So when we setting concept checking questions, we need to drill down to the essence of what we're checking. So, for example, we can check a positive by asking about a negative. So, for example, if we are asking, I don't know, about glass, the word glasses or glass. So we can say, does this help you read? Does this glass help you read? No, it doesn't. I mean, very basic things like that. But with concept checking questions, as far as reading goes, you've got the text there as a guide. So you can ask specific things about a text. You can ask about the definitions of words, for examples. You can ask about the meaning, the comprehension of a text, true or false questions, for example. I think we could talk about a whole webinar about concept checking questions. Sometimes it could be a yes or no question. It could be simple as that. There's no harm to ask a concept checking question that gives you a very direct answer. Okay, are there any more questions about what we've spoken about today? So are there any questions about skimming or scanning, or bottom up and top down processing? Are there any other ideas about what kind of texts you should use with your students? So just to finish off, I think I'll say that reading I love reading. I read every single day. I love to get my students to read as much as possible. It really does raise their competencies in other skills: reading, writing, speaking, even speaking, listening, grammar, comprehension, and vocabulary for sure. You can talk about different strategies for taking notes and recording vocabulary. Cass says if they don't enjoy reading things and prefer to watch things such as movies or series, we can encourage them to watch their movies with English subtitles. Yes, so this little bit different from actually reading skills, but certainly listening to a text or watching a movie or a video with subtitles would be good. And why not get them to read the novelization of their favorite movie in English? How about that? Or reading the graphic novel version of their favorite movie in English, or a reader designed for their specific level. What grabs their attention? Okay, well, I think that's everything from me today. I hope that you found something interesting in today's webinar. Thank you very, very much for your comments today and your contributions. It's really means a lot to me. And have fun out there. Enjoy helping your students to read better. Take care. Before we actually leave today, I would like you to mm, give me some feedback from today's webinar. And if you could find your way to the survey, let me know, how can I improve my presentations? Is there anything else that you would like to learn in these webinars? Which things do you struggle with specifically when teaching? Which things interest you? Which things engage your students you the most? So please do go along to give me some feedback. And again, thank you so much. Goodbye.